Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Joining me again today is none other than Darrius. Hey Darrius, how's it going?
Yeah, doing great. Although slightly disappointed, we ended our streak of wearing the same shirt.
I know, right? You don't have this cool malware finds a way shirt? I
I
mean,
do
come
not.
on.
We have to pick that one up.
Well, today, Darrius and I are going to be talking about cloud security wins, quick wins, cloud security quick wins for defenders, right? So we have a number of episodes where we talk about quick wins for defenders, things you can do to protect your organization, your firm, and your environment from attackers. We talked, if you saw the episode last week, we did an episode about Active Directory security quick wins. So that was all about internal security. Well, today, Darrius and I are going to be talking about cloud security. So Darrius, why don't you set the stage for us and what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so a lot of these I feel like are pretty low-level things to implement, and these are also a lot of times things that we've seen on actual engagements in terms of us being red teamers. So first off, I think let's start with access control because that's a huge thing, and it can be really hard to implement properly, regardless of the cloud service you use. That's just because, and that's mainly because a lot of times, one, cloud providers, whether you're in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, there are a million different components, and they constantly get changed and modified, and it can be pretty tough to stay on top of the latest changes as well as trying to find up-to-date documentation. I can't tell you how many times I've done something once, looked at the Microsoft documentation, it works, and then 2 weeks later, I'm like, oh yeah, this is how you do it, and it's completely different, and I can't find up-to-date documentation. Like it's a nightmare sometimes.
Wait, you mean up-to-date documentation is hard to find? I can't believe it.
Shocker, right? So it can be tough for security teams, and on top of security teams, even IT teams, to be able to properly implement and control their cloud instance. But I will say one of the best and easiest ways to control it right off the bat starts with access control and limiting who even has access to your console/portal. Before we get into that, one other thing I'll say is that I think a lot of the tips that we're going to talk about are pretty, cloud agnostic, but I think we're going to speak more specifically to Azure and Microsoft 365. That's just because that's me personally. That is what I am more familiar with, and we tend to see that in most of our engagements as well.
Yep.
Cool. So first, I would say restrict access to your portal/console. Within Azure, this is something that often gets overlooked. If you go into Azure and then Azure Active Directory, in one of the blades, there's the option for user settings, and you can actually it's not turned on by default, but you can restrict user access to the Azure portal. And the reasons why you should probably do this is because if we pop one account, we now have access to your portal, which means we can enumerate users, groups, domains. We can spin up rogue subscriptions. There's so much we can do once we have access to the Azure portal. It's better to just restrict it, and then from then on out, only authorized users based on the role or group that you give them will be able to access the portal.
Yeah, it's like a social engineering gold mine, right? Because you have usernames, their names, their titles, everything that would be in their profile, their Azure AD profile, to pull from and use. So really good info there.
Oh, exactly. Especially my biggest thing is to continue off what you're saying are you can literally look at the roles that every user has. So at that point, it's like, hey, I know exactly who I need to fish so that I can achieve my end goal.
Yep.
So yeah, definitely easy win. Definitely implement it. Next, I'll say, restrict the creation of app registrations. That's something else that you can do within the same, user settings as well. So for those who don't know, app registrations are essentially kind of the equivalent of API access, like creating an API key and another platform. And so with that, what you can do is you can create an app registration, and you can grant that app registration permissions to basically do any and everything Microsoft 365. So from SharePoint to Defender for
Yep.
Endpoints, every single Microsoft service has a certain set of permissions that you can delegate to app registrations. And with the right social engineering, you can create an app registration and convince an IT admin to grant those permissions to the app registration. And at that point, you have full blown access.
Yep. So for example, you could create an app registration to essentially read everyone's emails,
yeah,
right? Which
or send emails as anyone within the company. Which once again, hey, if I'm trying to fish people, what better way to do it than from inside the house?
Exactly.
So another easy win. Same with turning off the ability for users to create subtenants. Also another easy win. And that really just comes down to making sure your users can't spin up their own Azure tenant that is connected to your tenant.
Yep. Now, while we're talking about access control things, like restricting user access and stuff like that, we should talk about MFA. Yep. You've got interesting stories doing web and external pen testing. I have interesting stories doing internal pen testing. I think every pen tester does. But the main thing, and we wanted to convey with this cloud security quick wins thing, is making sure that MFA is not only enabled, that it's enforced for all accounts, and that users have set up their authenticator, right? We see a lot of times where we will be, password spraying an organization. They'll have 12,000 users or something, and 0.1% of those are accounts that are new accounts or somebody new that's starting at the firm, and they've set their password. It's a good password, maybe even, but they haven't configured MFA. And what that means is that if we're able to get access to that account, either through a credential that's found on the dark web, or password spraying, or some other means, or phishing even perhaps, right? If we're able to get access to that account and log in, and that account does not have multi-factor authentication enabled at least the first time, then we can set up multi-factor and essentially take over that account, right? And I think you've done that a number of times on engagements, Darrius. It's a very unintended, sneaky way to get access to an account, because you turn on MFA, you enforce it, you think everything is good, but sure enough, there's that one user that hasn't configured it yet, and now that spells some bad news for you.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because once you enable it, it is very much a case of, hey, first person to do it.
Yep.
So you much rather it be your end users. So for anyone that's implementing, has the project of turning on MFA, I definitely think that is the last crucial step that often gets forgotten about. I also want to say, specifically when it comes to MFA, you don't want to focus just on your user accounts. I think it's also important to think about that within the context of your service accounts as well. So, I was in an engagement one time, popped a web app, went from web app to the underlying system, dug around a little bit, found a config file which contained the credentials to their company's, no reply service account, no MFA set up.
Right.
So, and that is a service account that tends to be overly permissive in a lot of environments, just because it's really easy to just be like, yeah, just give it whatever. Or, that tends to be how service accounts go in general. So for that, I will say, and that kind of leads us into our next point. One, if you're going to have a service account and you need MFA on it, then make sure it's to a number, it's configured and goes to somebody's number. But in a lot of cases, what a lot of companies do is with their service accounts, they'll create an exclusion within their policies so that service accounts aren't required to have MFA, right? Because you don't want it to mess with your automation.
They're not human operated accounts a lot of times.
Yeah. So that leads to the next point of making sure you are fully utilizing, at least within Azure, your conditional access policies. These are a very powerful thing, which basically allows you to restrict access to your resources based on, what seems to be like an infinite number of criterias, and you can mix and match. So you can do things such as, hey, if you're within this group, then you have to have MFA, and you have to be coming from,
Yep.
this country on a device that is compliant with our, like, there's so much you can do. And in the case of service accounts, I think, an easy win would be, hey, if we know our service accounts only run internally or on our networks, then you should have a conditional access policy that says, hey, you're only able to log
Yep.
in from our domain, nowhere else. And that way, if you set it up properly, along with proper notifications, if it ever logs in outside of that, you're going to get an alert for it.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And, whether it's Microsoft or Duo or Okta or any of the other IDPs and authentication like service providers, they all have similar things. So Duo and Okta and things like that will have similar policies that you can set to restrict authentication to and from and where and how and from which devices and things like that. And I know Duo has certain security policies that are similar to conditional access, such that if the device isn't up to date or if it's on the wrong OS, you can restrict access or deny access and things like that. So when it comes to Microsoft's conditional access policy, they have templates. So go Google Microsoft conditional access policy templates, and then there's a whole bunch of templates, and there's some documentation around those. So you can use those as a guide. But the other quick win I'll have that's related to conditional access is blocking legacy authentication, right? Blocking legacy authentication, that's blocking things, blocking authentication that doesn't support MFA. So that's the reason we want to block that, is because it doesn't support MFA. So older protocols, older methods of authenticating don't support MFA, and therefore, if I do get access to an account, or if I guess a password or I spray it and it's valid, I can now log in through that service, and I won't be needing to prompt to MFA because that service doesn't support it because it's a legacy authentication. So definitely consider that in your conditional access policy strategy.
Another thing I'll say is, and this kind of just goes overall, is, really know what your services and how they're implemented. I know with conditional access policies, as you have multiple policies, you want to make sure that one policy isn't neutering another one.
Yep.
There's actually the ability to within Azure it kind of will analyze your policies, and it'll tell you like, hey, this policy takes precedence over this policy, and that may cause an issue. So you definitely want to make sure you do that. And then I know there's always the concern of, oh man, this is going to impact end users, we shouldn't implement it. Well, conditional access policies, you actually have the ability to put it in audit mode first.
Yep.
So that way, it's easier to get buy-in from upper management, and you can come back a month later maybe and say like, hey, here are all the things that happened that we could have prevented.
Yep, definitely. And so leading to the next point is a very quick point, but I think it's something that is really important and something that we don't stress enough. It's something that we see oftentimes in incident response, especially BEC cases, business email compromise. We'll go to do a BEC, and the organization will have an older Microsoft tenant, and they won't have the audit log set up. Normally, back in the day, and I say back in the day, it was like just last year or so, new tenants did not have audit logging turned on by default. It's now called Microsoft Purview, but it used to be that it wasn't enabled by default. You'd have to go in and go to the audit log section. You have to click the blue banner or the blue bar that says turn it on. Now Microsoft has changed that, and new tenants will have it enabled. And I think even older tenants, they will have it enabled as well. But definitely make sure you have audit logging enabled. So that's Purview logs. But also check your Azure logs, right? Or whatever your IDP is. If you're using Duo or if you're using Okta, make sure you have good audit logs so you can see, should you need to go to those logs to look at suspicious logins or something like that, make sure you have those logs. And then two, make sure you have those logs for a certain period of time. By default with the Microsoft Purview, I believe it's 90 days of logs. And even with the base level of Azure AD, if you don't have like P1 or P2, it's just 90 days, right? So how confident are you that you aren't going to need to go back more than 90 days to investigate a security incident, right? I don't know. I don't know about you, but I would like to have more than 90 days of logs. So definitely something to consider. And it's a quick win because you just turn it on and make sure that you are capturing those logs and storing them for a certain period of time, whatever fits your needs.
And you're definitely going to want this prior to an incident. You definitely don't want
Yep.
to wind up in an incident, and when higher ups are like, okay, what's going on, or when the incident response
Yep.
team is like, okay, we need to review logs. You don't want to have your pants
Yeah.
down around your ankles, and it's just like, oh,
Yeah.
you don't have logs. That's
I
probably the worst
yeah.
situation you can be in.
It's the worst feeling in the world when we go to help an organization. They have a BEC. They lost $700,000, and you go to investigate. They're a Microsoft shop. They do all their stuff through Microsoft 365, and you go and you look, and it's like, oh, audit log wasn't enabled. It's like, oh man, you still have some Azure logs, but you don't have all that audit logging in the Microsoft 365 tenant. So it's gut wrenching feeling to be in an incident response scenario like that. So definitely something quick and easy to check.
Nice. So next we have, like with most things, you want to implement the practice of least privilege, especially within your cloud environment. So I'm going to set the scene a little bit because I think a lot of viewers will be able to resonate with this. A couple years ago, higher ups were like, we need to move to the cloud. I hear so much about it. We're going to move to the cloud. Let's do it. You get the project started, and then you get a group of people who it's like, hey, we kind of know about it, but not really. We're just going to start, we're going to, take it in strides and do what we can. And you spend up resources and you grant out permissions. And eventually what ends up happening is, you have people who have privileges to do things that they shouldn't. And, sometimes due to a lack of knowledge that can basically result in significant risk to the company. So the prime example I will give is, you have a team of developers, and they are the best developers in the world. However, they're not necessarily security minded. And an additional fact, all they figured out like, hey, via my coding knowledge and experience, I can spin up infrastructure via code, which is even better.
Yep.
But they're not necessarily always security minded or even know about the security functions within the cloud. They just know, hey, I can spin up a VM and I can have these scripts automatically configure the VM to do everything that to basically reach out to GitHub, put our code on it, spin all the services up, and we're good to go. Except for the fact that RDP is now open in the box, and now it's publicly exposed to the internet because maybe it's on by default. It's things like that where I think it's you really want to make sure you implement least privilege. Not every developer on the team needs access to spin up resources. You want to restrict that, and ideally, the development teams should work with the security teams to kind of implement this together to make sure that you're not leaving holes open, which really just kind of leads to the importance of DevOps and now DevSecOps. Supposed to work in tandem as a team. Let developers develop. Let the operations team handle the infrastructure, and then let security do their thing, and have everybody work in tandem.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those scenarios where the development team or the engineers are relying on like IT or security to tell them when things are wrong, and then the IT and security team are relying on the developers to tell them when they have new resources needs or things like that. And there oftentimes is a miscommunication. Both sides are expecting each other to communicate, right? But neither are because they're expecting the other one to communicate first, kind of thing, if that makes sense. And we see that a lot, especially in organizations that are doing their own development. They're pushing new infrastructure on a regular basis. So definitely something to consider. Along with that least privilege kind of discussion is, and this is something we see very often in the IT security assessments that we do. We see it often in the Microsoft 365 security assessments that we do, and we definitely see it on pen tests, is the use of daily use accounts for administrative purposes. So what I mean by that is oftentimes we'll see an organization that has, their IT admin It's their daily use account that he uses for email and for browsing the web and doing his day-to-day work. That will also be the global admin account for their tenant, right? And the problem with that is, if that admin gets phished or that account gets compromised, now you have access to a global admin account. And so what we recommend is decoupling those, right? Don't have daily use accounts in global admins, don't have daily use accounts be service accounts and things like that because of the obvious risk to those. So that's definitely a quick win. It's just decoupling those accounts.
Yeah, agreed. And that's a perfect segue into another point that I'm pretty passionate about is, especially within Azure, is implement privilege identity management. Which essentially just kind of results in just-in-time permissions and privileges.
Yep.
It's fairly easy to set up, but essentially what will happen is, now you essentially what that means and what you can do is you can say, hey, this user has access to this role or this set of permissions. For the sake of argument, let's say global admin. However, your account doesn't always have those permissions. You have to essentially turn the permissions on and off as needed. Um, and I think that's an easy thing to implement. It does require a workflow change, but man, it reduces risk significantly, in
Yep.
my opinion. So that if I'm an admin, if I know I need to perform a function, a global admin function, I can log in. Then from there, I can say, okay, I'm going to basically turn on that privilege. And I think the cool thing about that is, one, you get logging every single time you turn it on.
Yep.
Depending on how you can configure it, you can say, hey, your privileges are only are only live for a set period of time. So you could do like maybe, hey, 15 minutes or, maybe a day. You can mix and match and change it based on the role and permissions. And then I think another cool thing about it is you can even configure it so that someone else has to,
Yep.
sign off and agree, which I think is a whole other additional level of,
Yep.
hey, I need global admin permissions really quickly to do XYZ. Spencer approved it. So you
Yep.
kind of get a little bit of change management as
Yeah.
well. So I think it's already baked in. I highly recommend
Yeah.
implementing that.
Yeah, that was something I was going to mention. Was you mentioned the workflow change, and a lot of times there's an approval process for things like that. And so you can, if you are diligent about it and you have a good process for it, and you're not just blindly approving by email or something, or something like that. There needs to be a method to validate that approval, right? And you can go so many layers deep with trust, right? But ultimately, that workflow change means having someone approve that access that isn't the person requesting it, right?
Yeah.
So in bigger shops, they'll have a team of people that approve those requests and validate them and audit them and track them down. But that's kind of the idea with that.
And then additionally, to your point that you mentioned earlier, if the account gets compromised, at least the threat actor doesn't immediately have those permissions.
Yep.
Would have to attempt to elevate. That's a bigger chance of the threat actor being caught.
Darrius, why didn't you call this section zero trust?
Because I hate buzzwords.
But that's essentially the methodology, right? Is you don't trust, you don't inherently trust, you always verify. That's the concept of zero trust, and it is a buzzword, but that is at the core of it. That's part of the methodology of zero trust.
Agreed. So I think some of these aren't necessarily security related, but I do think they're good recommendations just to make your life easier in terms of managing your cloud resources. So, automate what you can. I think we're now kind of in the era of, we have infrastructure as code, and we should take full advantage of that. In my opinion, um, as you get more mature, you shouldn't have your infrastructure team, physically logging into Azure or AWS and manually creating resources. If you know it's going to be a repeat resource, write a script, write a playbook, and implement it. So that way, you set it up, you configure it once, you make sure that the config is secure, and then you're good to go. And I think that really also kind of is a huge driving point of DevSecOps, right? You want your development team to be able to work as quickly as possible. And the ops and sec part of it, right, is to provide the roadmap and the parameters so that the developers can do what they need to do. So,
Yep.
automate everything. It makes life easier. That's something that's super helpful. Another thing I'll say is utilize tags and the tagging systems in your cloud service. That's something that often gets forgotten. Um, my personal recommendation is I like to when I create tags, I will first of all create a tag that's like, okay, is it development, testing, or production? Um, and same with the dates that it was created, as well as who created it. And you can obviously add more, do what makes sense for your organization. I think those three are super important, at least particularly within Azure, because to your point, Spencer, after X period of days, logs are gone.
Yep.
If you have what will happen is years will go by. Somebody will be like, "Hey, what's this thing? I don't know. Who created it?
Yep.
I don't know." And now it's like this fear of, can we get rid of it? No one knows. If we delete it, are we going to break everything? And so, proper tagging along with proper change control alleviates some of those issues. And you can even enforce, specific tags on resources in Azure via policies. So you can say, hey, every single VM we spin up has to have these tags. And you can even tie that into your automations as well. So
Yep.
nice things to have. Let's see here. I think we also have. I think this is a kind of an easy win as well. Of and a lot of cloud service providers. I know Azure, AWS, and I imagine Google has it too. Is they have recommendations, whether it's for optimization, whether it's for security. A lot of times they'll have recommendations, and if you click on them, they'll take you right to the section where you need to make the change and tell you
Yep.
exactly what to do. When in doubt, follow the best practices of the provider.
Yeah, and I think even Microsoft has some of those where it'll automatically fix it for you. Like you click on it and you approve it and all that stuff. But I think some of them, like the cloud security posture check or whatever Microsoft calls it, will have some auto remediation things that it can do for you. Enabling settings. For example, like the secure defaults, right? Secure defaults is a number of configuration things that is kind of a recommendation item that Microsoft has in Azure, and you just check the box and it enables multi-factor, it disables legacy auth, it does a number of other things to kind of secure a new Microsoft 365 / Azure tenant. So definitely agree, using those things is as much as you can to kind of shore up some of your gaps is really helpful.
And then I guess really, I guess the last thing I'll say is, one, create alerts for certain actions. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. Just like, on-prem, you should have alerts whenever someone gets added to the domain admin group. You should have alerts for if someone, gets the global admin role.
Yep.
So, make sure those are custom to your environment. And then the last I'll say is, this is more of an architectural thing, is specifically with Microsoft, know the difference between your portals, because while Microsoft can do a lot, it's a double-edged sword, right? So know the difference between your Intune portal versus your Defender for Endpoint portal versus your Azure portal versus SharePoint. Like, make sure you know the difference
Yep.
between the two. It can be confusing. Microsoft does not make it easy, especially with all the changes. But knowing that is crucial for management.
Yep.
And then another thing I'll say is, make sure you understand your cloud services and your resources, and understanding like why you chose a certain architecture, or why you decided to handle things a certain way. And really, I think the major benefit and one easy way to do that is you should have a cloud team if possible. And if you're too small, that's fine. You can have a cloud cabinet, or like one of my old jobs. we picked people from the the infrastructure team and the IT and the development team and the support team, and that basically made up the cabinet. And we would deliberate and decide what to do as a
Yep.
group. Um, and it's because cloud services can get expensive. We all heard the story of the kid who spun up something in AWS and then he had like a $4,000 bill. It
Yep.
happens. There are a lot of architectural decisions that can be made, specifically with web apps, on how to handle things. Like within Azure, it's like, hey, do I want to use app service or VM, or do I want a logic app, or should I use that like the Azure function? There's so much you can do. At the end of the day, I think it's one of the top things you can do is get together, decide as a company, hey, these are the resources we deploy. This is why. And then you can also do it in Azure is you can turn off the ability to turn off. You can turn off the ability to create certain types of resources. And the more you restrict things, the better off you are.
Yep. Awesome. Well, Darrius, any last minute thoughts or quick tips for cloud security?
Man,
I think we covered a massive list. I think by now everyone listening is probably an expert in cloud. At least by the metrics of people who say they're experts at like crypto or anything else, right? Online. But no, in all seriousness, we hope that this episode on cloud security, quick wins for defenders, was helpful to you. Hopefully you got some sort of value out of this at some point along the way. Hopefully there was something that you recognized that you weren't doing yet, or maybe something you should take a look at. But nonetheless, we hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you got value. If you did enjoy it and you want to help us out, the best way you can do that is by sharing our podcast, our blog with your peers, with your network. So do feel free to share it online, share the podcast, our blog, follow the show, like, subscribe. All that kind of helps us reach more people and kind of help educate other people on these awesome security topics. So with that, that's our show.
Only thing I'll add is if you are on Twitter and you want to support us, #KnowYourTools, feel free to use that. We should.
Hey, there you go. Darrius with the what's it called?
Plugging our hashtag.
Yeah, I forget the buzzword marketing term for it, but yeah, #KnowYourTools with Secure IT 360. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you next time.